All right, it's Saturday. A quick fun video. When I was a teenager, the only show I was ever on TV that I was interested in was Bonanza. And that, of course, was a story about the big ranch in Nevada called the Ponderosa. And I watched that every Sunday night. And my parents, when I would do something wrong, my punishment was I couldn't watch Bonanza. So I pretty much tried to stay as straight as I could because I did not want to miss one episode of Bonanza. So there was an episode that I remember that as a young teenager, it somehow shaped the way I look at problems. So here's the setting. The cattle ranchers in Nevada. They have their calves and they're born in the spring, and then they feed them all summer long while the grass is growing. Now in the fall, the cattle are about as fat as they're going to get and the grass has died off, but the ranchers can't keep all those extra fat cattle through the winter because there's not enough feed for them for the winter. So what the pattern was, in the fall, the cattle ranchers in Nevada would ship all their fat cattle to Chicago on the train. And they've been doing that for probably about 15 to 20 years in that episode. And of course, as the fall cattle round up and the cattle sale gets closer, they're all getting excited. Well, they start counting up their cows and looking at everything, and they start talking to the railroad and whatever, and all of a sudden they find out that a rich guy from New York has bought an option on every single cattle car that the railroad had between Nevada and Chicago. Now, what an option is means to use that railroad car from Nevada to Chicago was probably, I'm going to say that was probably around $100, maybe $110. But you could get an option on it for $20, meaning if you paid $20 towards each car in advance, the railroad would hold that railroad car for you. So this rich guy from New York, he just paid the $20 towards every railroad car, and then, of course, he had the option to use the railroad car. Now, there was a time limit on it, meaning at a certain point, he had to cough up the rest of the $100 or the rest of the $110 or whatever the full price would be. But the option meant he controlled that car, and he had the option to buy it, to finish buying the use of the car, or release it. Well, his plan was, since he had control over all the railroad cars, the cattlemen in Nevada would not be able to ship any cattle to Chicago unless they did business with him. Now, the price of cattle at that time in this episode was $30 a head. He was going to offer to pay them $7 or $8 a head. And what he thought would happen is they would have to sell to him because, first of all, they couldn't carry those cattle over the winter because they had no feed for them. And secondly, a lot of them probably owed money at the bank, and the bank would want them to collect whatever they could to try to reduce that down. So he thought he was in a pretty good position. And so the cattlemen were in a terrible fix. Well, now the hero, Ben Cartwright, the father of the Ponderosa. And this is where this episode begins to help me understand how to deal with problems. They're all going to court. They're going to trying to get a judge to force the guy to release the cars, and trying to go to the railroad and make the railroad release the cars and all. But it's all legal. The guy had legally bought an option on all the cars, and legally he had the right to hold those cars until the date that the option was over. So they were all trying to figure out how they were going to do it. They even thought about criminal activity and all kinds of stuff. Well, Ben Cartwright now, he comes up with a plan to fix it, but he course, didn't want to tell anybody about it because someone could foil his plan. So he mortgages his whole Ponderosa through 2 or 3 friends he has at banks, and they basically provide him with what's called a letter of credit for $1 million. $1 million back then, $1 million in that episode. And then what he did was he took the letter of credit from those friends, those banks, and he went all the way along the rail route from Nevada to Chicago, and he bought all the hay up. All the hay that all those stations had already bought and put on the side to sell to the cattle shippers, he bought it all up because it took a week to get the cattle to Chicago. So every night or every 2 days or whenever they would stop, they'd have to feed the cattle. So if you didn't have hay to feed them, any cattle you bought in Nevada would be dead by the time you got them to Chicago. So Ben comes back to Nevada there, Carson City, and the big shot is in the process of trying to buy the cattle from everybody. And some of the farmers have had to go ahead and sell because they owed the bank and they couldn't carry the cattle, and it was a mess. And then Ben Cartwright reveals that he owned all the hay, and he wouldn't release the hay unless that guy from New York paid the right price for the cattle. So therefore, this guy from New York who had this clever scheme, now he's faced with, well, I can't buy any cattle because I can't get them to Chicago. And in about another month or so, I'm going to owe the rest of the money on all these railroad cars. So what he did was he ended up paying the $30 a head for the cattle. Now, he was still going to make a few dollars in Chicago, but he was just going to make the normal, rate. He was trying to make a killing off of these cattlemen. Well, anyway, that episode, for some reason, always stuck in my head about if you have a problem, you just got to keep thinking about how it can be resolved. You can't just stop at the first couple of tries at it. And that, for some reason, that episode has sort of made Ben Cartwright a hero in my life. That he was smart enough to figure out how to resolve it, and then he risked everything he had to make sure that got resolved. And the main point that I remember about it was he did it on behalf of everybody. He didn't go and just get enough to take care of his cattle. What he did was he took care of all the cattlemen that were his neighbors. I'll see you in church Sunday.